A wild scene in a courtroom in New Jersey this week, a judge laying into the Trump administration for its chaotic oversight of federal prosecutions in the Garden State. Judge Zahid Qureshi interrupting a sentencing and laying into a prosecutor, telling the prosecutor that he wanted the three people who are currently in charge of the U.S. Attorney's Office to come down to his courtroom and answer questions under oath. Now, those three people have been put in charge after the former interim U.S. Attorney, Alina Habba, was removed. A judge had found that she was serving illegally, that she had gone past her allotted time as the interim U.S. Attorney. A judge last week ruled that the three people who replaced her are also serving illegally because they were appointed to the post without confirmation by the U.S. Senate. Judge Qureshi seized on that and said he wanted answers as to who is running that U.S. Attorney's Office, who is approving prosecutions, and who is approving plea agreements. He took issue with the plea agreement underlying the sentencing that he was supposed to preside over, calling it a sloppy investigation and saying that the agreement was reached prematurely.
Hi peeps, Adam is here. So this has just happened. There is a moment in every administration when the people in power discover that the Constitution is not a suggestion. It is not a set of guidelines that can be ignored when inconvenient. It is the law. And when you try to bypass it, when you try to build a workaround, when you think you have found a clever way to do what the Constitution explicitly prohibits, there is a federal judge sitting in a courthouse somewhere who will read your clever plan, look you in the eye through the pages of a ruling, and tell you in the clearest language possible that what you are doing is unconstitutional. That moment just arrived for Pam Bondi and the Trump administration.
US President Donald Trump's former personal lawyer, Alina Habba, has been disqualified from serving as New Jersey's top federal prosecutor. Habba was disqualified after a federal appeals court said the Trump administration had performed maneuvers to keep her in the role contrary to federal laws governing appointments. She had been Trump's attorney in criminal and civil proceedings before he was elected to a second term. She briefly served as a White House advisor before Trump named her as acting federal prosecutor in March. Judges had questioned the government's moves to keep Habba in place after her interim appointment expired and without getting Senate confirmation. The government argued Habba is validly serving the role under a federal statute allowing the first assistant attorney, a post she was appointed to by the Trump administration. After the decision, attorneys for the appealees said they would continue to challenge President Trump's unlawful appointments of purported U.S. attorneys wherever appropriate.
And it arrived in a way that no amount of spinning or media management can undo. What happened in a federal courtroom in New Jersey over the past few days is one of those stories that should stop you in your tracks. It happened relatively quietly, without the fanfare of a congressional hearing or the drama of a live television confrontation. But it is a major setback for how Trump and Bondi are trying to reshape the Justice Department, and it reveals something fundamental about the limits of executive power that the Trump administration keeps trying to ignore.
Now, the judge has scheduled a hearing in May for the three people running that U.S. Attorney's Office to appear before him. At that same hearing on Monday, he also threw a supervising attorney from the U.S. Attorney's Office out of the courtroom. That man had sought several times to interject. The judge was irked, saying that that man had not received permission to speak.
Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because the details matter. There was a separate prosecution in New Jersey. A federal judge in that case had issued a disqualification order. The judge disqualified Alina Habba, one of Trump's longtime personal lawyers, from being involved in a particular prosecution in the New Jersey U.S. Attorney's Office. The judge's ruling was clear. Habba is disqualified. She cannot work on this case. She cannot be involved in this prosecution. That was a legal order from a federal judge. Pam Bondi did not like that ruling. She was unhappy with being told that Habba could not work on the case. And rather than accept the judge's order and move on, Bondi decided to find a way around it. She wanted to work around the disqualification. She wanted to find a way to let Habba continue to be involved and influence the office even if technically she could not work on that particular case. So Bondi came up with what she thought was a clever workaround. Her plan was to appoint 3 DOJ lawyers to run the entire Newark U.S. Attorney's Office instead of having a Senate-confirmed U.S. attorney in charge. The idea was simple. If these 3 DOJ lawyers were running the office and answering directly to Bondi and to Trump, they would not be bound by the disqualification that the other judge had issued against Habba. They could just ignore it or work around it. They could make sure Habba's interests were protected and her influence was maintained even though she was technically disqualified from the case. Bondi was trying to bypass the normal constitutional and statutory process for appointing a U.S. attorney. She was trying to eliminate the Senate confirmation process entirely. She was trying to give herself and Trump total control over the office without any of the checks and balances that the Constitution requires. A federal judge looked at that plan and said absolutely not. The judge's ruling was devastating. It said that what Bondi was trying to do violates the Constitution. Not just a procedural rule, not just a technicality, the Constitution. The judge said that Bondi cannot appoint people to run a U.S. attorney's office without going through the proper constitutional and legal procedures. The judge said that Bondi cannot bypass the Senate confirmation process whenever she wants to appoint someone she can control, and the judge shut down Bondi's workaround, ruling it unlawful and unconstitutional. That is a massive defeat for Bondi and for the Trump administration's attempt to build a personalized Justice Department that operates outside normal legal procedures and constitutional constraints. And this is not just about staffing one office. This is about the fundamental question of whether the Trump administration respects the Constitution and the rule of law. It is about whether the executive branch can simply ignore the constitutional framework that has governed the appointment of U.S. attorneys for centuries. It is about whether the judiciary still has the power to enforce constitutional limits on executive overreach. But the bad news for Bondi did not stop there. At the same time that this ruling came down, in a related hearing in the same New Jersey court, another federal judge delivered an absolutely searing and devastating rebuke of how the Newark U.S. Attorney's Office was being run and managed. U.S. District Judge Zahid Qureshi gave a blistering criticism of the DOJ office and of Bondi's management. He said the office was acting unlawfully in multiple respects. He said the office was damaging its credibility with the judiciary and making it harder for courts to function. He became so frustrated with the DOJ prosecutor's conduct in court that he ordered the prosecutor removed from his courtroom for insubordination. He called the conduct embarrassing. He basically said the DOJ office is being so badly mismanaged under Bondi that serious defendants are getting off the hook because the office is so chaotic and dysfunctional. Let me pause here and let the weight of that sink in. A federal judge with real authority, with the power to hold people in contempt, with the power to enforce court orders, looked at how Bondi is running the Justice Department and said that the office is acting unlawfully, that it is damaging its credibility with the judiciary, that its conduct is embarrassing, and that the dysfunction is so severe that defendants are escaping accountability. That is not a minor criticism. That is not a procedural disagreement. That is a federal judge saying, in the strongest possible terms, that the leadership of the Justice Department is failing. When you put these two things together, the constitutional ruling against Bondi's staffing workaround and the scathing judicial rebuke of how the office is being managed, you get a very clear picture. A picture of a Justice Department in chaos. A picture of an Attorney General trying to run the DOJ like a personal fiefdom without regard for normal procedures or constitutional constraints. A picture of that attempt running into real legal and constitutional problems when judges push back. Now, let me explain why what Bondi was trying to do is so important and why the judge's ruling matters for the separation of powers and for the rule of law. Because this is not just a procedural ruling about administrative details. This is a ruling about whether the Trump administration respects constitutional limits on executive power. This is a ruling about whether the judiciary still has the power to enforce the Constitution against executive overreach. This is a ruling about whether the rule of law still constrains the president and his agents. Pam Bondi's overall approach to the Justice Department has been to try to build a loyal, Trump-responsive political machine. She is trying to replace experienced career prosecutors with people who will be responsive to Trump's interests and to her direction. She is trying to remove or sideline officials who are not on the Trump team or who show any sign of independence. She is trying to reshape the DOJ from an institution that is supposed to be independent and focused on the law into an institution that serves Trump's political interests. The workaround with the Newark office is a perfect example of how Bondi is trying to accomplish that broader goal. The idea of appointing 3 DOJ lawyers to run the office instead of a Senate-confirmed U.S. attorney is a way of bypassing and circumventing the normal checks and balances built into the constitutional system. Normally, U.S. attorneys are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. That Senate confirmation process is built into the Constitution for a reason. It is supposed to serve as a check on presidential power. The Senate is supposed to make sure that U.S. attorneys are qualified, competent, and independent. The Senate is supposed to make sure that U.S. attorneys are not just partisan loyalists who will do whatever the president tells them to do. But if Bondi can simply appoint 3 DOJ lawyers without Senate confirmation, she bypasses that constitutional check entirely. She eliminates that constraint. She can appoint people who will do exactly what she and Trump tell them to do. That is the appeal of the workaround from Bondi's perspective. That is why she tried to do it. The judge said no. The judge said that violates the Constitution. The judge said that violates the statute governing U.S. attorney appointments. And here is why that matters so much. The Constitution gives the Senate a specific role in the appointment process because the framers believed that having the Senate confirm certain appointments would serve as a meaningful check on presidential power. The framers wanted to make sure that the president could not just appoint loyalists and cronies to every position of authority. They wanted some independent institutional check on who gets to run important government offices and who gets to exercise federal power. When Bondi tried to bypass that check by appointing 3 DOJ lawyers without Senate confirmation, she was trying to eliminate that constitutional constraint entirely. She was trying to give Trump and herself total control over the Newark office without any Senate involvement or oversight. She was trying to operate outside the constitutional framework. And the judge said that is not allowed. That is a judge enforcing constitutional limits on executive power. That is a judge saying that Bondi cannot just do whatever she wants. That is a judge saying that there are legal and constitutional constraints on how the DOJ can be run and who can run it and how people get appointed to positions of authority. And that is exactly the kind of thing the Trump administration is trying to push past and ignore. They want to operate without constraints. They want to use the Justice Department as a political weapon. And judges like the ones in New Jersey are saying no. Judge Qureshi's scathing rebuke of the Newark office is equally important and equally revealing. He basically said the office is being run so incompetently and so badly that the legal system itself is being harmed. He said that Bondi's approach to running the DOJ and staffing the office is creating such chaos and dysfunction that defendants are getting off the hook and justice is not being served. He ordered a DOJ prosecutor removed from his courtroom for insubordination and disrespect. He called the conduct embarrassing. That is a devastating statement from a federal judge with real authority and credibility. It is a judge with the power to enforce court orders and hold people in contempt, saying that the DOJ office is not functioning properly under Bondi. It is a judge saying that Bondi's attempt to turn the DOJ into a loyal political machine is having real negative consequences on the functioning of the courts and the legal system. When you combine that judicial criticism with the constitutional ruling against Bondi's staffing workaround, you get a very clear picture of what is happening. A Justice Department in serious trouble, an Attorney General trying to run the DOJ like a personal fiefdom and running into serious legal and constitutional problems when she tries to do it. Now, let me put this in broader institutional context. The Trump DOJ under Bondi has faced repeated and consistent courtroom setbacks and repeated harsh judicial criticism and rebukes. It is not just this one case in New Jersey. It is a clear pattern. Multiple cases where federal judges have rebuked the DOJ. Multiple cases where judges have said the DOJ is acting unlawfully or outside its authority or violating the Constitution. Multiple cases where the DOJ's mismanagement and dysfunction have had real negative consequences for the functioning of the courts and the pursuit of justice. That pattern is important because it shows that Bondi's attempt to build a personalized, Trump-responsive Justice Department focused on serving Trump's interests, rather than the law, is running into real obstacles and real constraints that it cannot overcome. It is running into judicial oversight and judicial enforcement of the Constitution. It is running into the rule of law, which Bondi and Trump thought they could operate above. It is running into judges who are willing to stand up and say no to executive overreach, and that is how the system is supposed to work. Judges are supposed to act as a meaningful check on executive power. Judges are supposed to enforce the Constitution even when it is inconvenient for the president. Judges are supposed to say when something is unlawful or unconstitutional or outside the bounds of legal authority. Judges like Qureshi and others in the federal judiciary across multiple courts are doing exactly that. They are enforcing the rule of law. They are standing up to executive overreach. They are saying no to unconstitutional actions. This is what the framers intended when they created an independent judiciary with the power to enforce constitutional limits on executive power. They understood that a president might try to exceed constitutional limits. They understood that an executive branch might try to operate outside the law. So they created an independent judiciary to enforce the Constitution and to say no to executive overreach. And that is what is happening in the federal courts right now with Trump and Bondi. Let me walk you through what this Bondi setback actually means and why it matters for understanding how Trump and Bondi are trying to reshape the Justice Department and how the courts are starting to push back against that effort. Bondi's attempt to appoint 3 DOJ lawyers to run the Newark office without Senate confirmation represents a deliberate and calculated attempt to bypass constitutional checks and balances that have been in place for centuries. It represents an attempt to give Trump and Bondi complete control over the office without any Senate involvement or oversight. It represents an attempt to eliminate the constitutional constraint that the Senate confirmation process is supposed to provide. When a federal judge ruled that this approach violates the Constitution, the judge was enforcing the constitutional framework that the framers set up. The judge was saying that you cannot just disregard the Constitution when it is inconvenient for you. The judge was saying that there are rules and you have to follow them. The judge was saying that constitutional constraints on executive power are real and enforceable. Judge Qureshi's scathing rebuke of the Newark office sends a powerful message about the consequences of trying to run the DOJ as a personal political machine focused on serving Trump's interests rather than the law. He basically said the office is being run so badly that the legal system is not functioning properly in that jurisdiction. He said that Bondi's approach to staffing and managing the office is creating chaos and undermining the functioning of the courts. That is a serious and devastating indictment of how Bondi is running the DOJ. It is not just a criticism of procedure or administrative details. It is a criticism of the substantive impact on the legal system and on justice. It is a statement that the way Bondi is running the DOJ is making the courts less able to function properly and making prosecutors less able to do their jobs properly. The pattern of courtroom defeats and harsh judicial criticism of the Bondi-era DOJ shows that federal judges are actively and consistently enforcing constitutional and legal limits on executive power. It is not just one judge in one case saying no to Bondi. It is multiple judges in multiple cases saying that the DOJ is acting unlawfully or unconstitutionally or outside proper bounds. That pattern is important because it shows that the judiciary is functioning as intended as a check on executive power. Judges are not just passively accepting what the Trump administration wants to do. Judges are actively pushing back. Judges are enforcing the law. Judges are saying that there are constraints and limits, and the Trump administration has to follow them. The Trump and Bondi attempt to build a personalized, loyal Justice Department is running into the reality that there are legal and constitutional constraints on how the federal government can operate. These constraints are real, and they are enforced. Trump and Bondi cannot just remake the DOJ into a personal political machine. They cannot just appoint loyalists to every position without following constitutional and statutory procedures. They cannot just tell judges and courts to do what they want and expect no resistance. There are rules, there are constraints, there is a constitution, there is a rule of law, and judges are enforcing it. The viral narrative about Trump panicking or Bondi suffering a humiliating defeat is based on real institutional setbacks and real constitutional problems with how Trump and Bondi are trying to run the government. The viral videos may exaggerate the emotional reaction and simplify the legal and constitutional issues. But underneath the viral spin and the dramatic framing is a real story about the rule of law still constraining the Trump administration. Underneath the viral narrative is a real story about judges saying no to executive overreach. Underneath the headlines and the drama is a real story about whether constitutional democracy is going to survive and whether the checks and balances that the framers built into the system are actually going to work. That is why this story matters so much. It is not just about staffing one U.S. attorney's office. It is about the fundamental question of whether the rule of law still applies to the executive branch. It is about whether Trump and Bondi can operate without legal and constitutional constraints, or whether the Constitution still constrains executive power. So far, judges are saying that the rule of law still applies. Judges are saying that there are real constraints. Judges are saying that constitutional limits on executive power are real and enforceable. And every time a federal judge enforces those constraints, it is a victory for democracy and the rule of law.